Hi everyone and welcome back for part 2 of the Highland Cow tutorial. Today we'll be completing step 5 and it's about 2 hours of drawing time for this one. This step is all about adding those really nice orange colours to the cow and you'll really see the drawing come to life in this part. I've picked out 6 colours for this step. I've got 2 yellow toned colours, the Faber-Castell Cadmium Yellow, which is a really bright yellow, and the Faber-Castell Raw Umber, which is a more muted browny yellow. Then the Faber-Castell Cadmium Orange, which is again a really bright orange colour. And the Caran d'Ache Brown Ochre 50%, which is a much more muted browny orange. And finally, for the reddish darker colours, I have the Faber-Castell Burnt Sienna and the Caran d'Ache Dark Flesh pencil. And I'm going to use a combination of these, so I've got the more muted colours to maintain that realistic tone to the fur, but I don't want to end up with it looking really muddy or muted, so I've got these additional brighter colours to add a little hint of them here and there to make sure the piece looks really bright and alive. And I'll start off in the upper left hand corner and work my way across and down. And the main base colour I am using is the Brown Ochre 50%. This is a really good colour to start building up layers and to use as a blending pencil as well. And I'm covering the whole surface of his left ear using the Brown Ochre pencil to start with. Now I'm using the cadmium yellow to start adding a bit of those yellow highlights we can see, especially towards the top of the ear. And I'm using really soft pencil marks with this and slowly building up the colour. Now with the burnt sienna colour, I'm going to focus on adding a few of the shadows we can see, mainly towards the inner portion of the ear. And you can use the blue layer that we put down in an earlier stage to sort of indicate where the shadows are and start building up colour in these sections. And I'm using a combination of shading small areas with this colour and also drawing some more defined lines. I'm just keeping going with the burnt sienna pencil and building up any shadows that I can see in this area. Now I'm using the cadmium orange to start building up that really bright orange colour that we can see. And you don't want to go in too hard to start with, instead you want to gradually build up this colour. And this also means that you get a nice variation in colour across the fur, which does help it look more realistic because you can see it's not all one colour and there are lots of different tones and values that you can see. I'm using the Caran d'Ache Dark Flesh pencil now, and you can see I've got a really sharp point for this because I want to be focusing this in the areas with the darkest shadows. And for this I'm trying to be quite precise with where I'm putting the pencil marks down, because I do want to start to form these bits of fur in the fringe that are crossing over and they're quite defined. So making sure I'm building up the shadow in the right place is really important here. I'm switching back to using the cadmium orange pencil, and again I'm building up that nice orange colour. And I am building this colour up gradually because it is a bit of a balancing act. You don't want the colours to look too dull and brown, but also you don't want to add too much of these bright colours, otherwise it won't look realistic in the end. So it's a good idea to be really gradual when you're building up these brighter colours. Now we're going to move on to complete the section around the nose. I'm using the brown ochre pencil to start with, and I'm lightly sketching out a few of the furs that are coming off from the nose, and this helps make sure the edges look really soft and fluffy. And I'm going around the nose and using this colour to start drawing in the fur, but I'm keeping the central part clear because that's a really orange colour, so I want to make sure it's not being muddied up by these softer brown colours. And I'm just following the fur pattern around the nose. And I've started off using really short, quick pencil marks, but as I'm getting towards the right hand bottom side of the mouth, I'm using slightly longer marks to imitate the longer bits of fur that we're seeing here. I'm also filling in the section below his nose as well. Now with the cadmium yellow, the really bright yellow colour, I'm starting to build up a layer in that in-between section that we missed out before. And I'm just going to go all the way around this area and fill in a nice light layer of this colour. And as always, we want to continue sketching in the same direction as the fur at all times. Now I'm using the burnt sienna to focus on the areas of shadow and those more reddy colours that we can see coming through. And again, you can see here that I'm starting to use longer pencil movements, again imitating the longer strands of fur that we can see in the photograph. And this section below the nose is quite dark, so we'll add quite a lot of this colour here and start to build up the darker layers below. Now with the cadmium orange, we're going to continue to build up that bright looking colour towards the middle section of the nose. And with this colour, we're essentially covering the same area that we did before with the cadmium yellow. Now it's time to fill in the really dark shadows using the dark flesh pencil. And I'm going to sketch in this really dark area below the mouth as well using this colour. But in a later step we are going to come back in and make this even more dark. Now we're going to move on to the section of his body directly below the nose, and this is quite a dark area. But again, I'm starting off with the brown ochre Caran d'Ache pencil, and I'm mainly filling in the sections between the dark blue colour that we've already got down. And the fur here is a lot looser and longer compared to the fur around his mouth, so I'm making sure to imitate that with my pencil movements. Now I've filled in a layer of this pencil between the blue areas we've already drawn. I'm going to move on to darkening it up a little, and I've got the burnt sienna pencil for this. And I'm using this to start adding those reddy colours that we can see in the photograph. Now with the cadmium orange, I'm adding just a few little marks throughout this section where I can see more bright, vibrant oranges coming through. But that's only really here and there, as this is really the darkest section of the entire drawing. And now with the dark flesh pencil, I'm really going to go in quite heavily and darken up most of this area. And I'm using the dark blue lines as a guide for which areas I need to make sure that are the darkest. Because if I'm going in and drawing with no plan, it's not going to end up looking really realistic at the end. So I'm making sure to try to generally stick to the outline that we've already made. And you can see now this is a really nice dark brown reddish colour. And you may be thinking it's not dark enough, it's not as dark as what you can see in the photo. But in one of the next steps we are going to be going in with some darker colours and making it look a bit more accurate. Now we'll move on to do this section around the eye. Again, I'm starting off with the brown ochre pencil and building up a nice layer of this colour to begin with. And I find doing this is really helpful for me to focus on the next section that I'm going to be completing and make it clear in my head where each colour is going to go. This is also quite a dark section, so I'm switching straight to using the burnt sienna pencil and starting to build up those reddy shadows that we can see. This feels like such a nice area to work with here. I feel like the direction of fur is really easy to draw like this. And I'm just continuing to draw down as it feels quite natural to keep following the fur direction here. Now I'm using the cadmium orange to pick out a few little highlights throughout this section and avoid the whole thing looking too dull or muddy. And I'll do the same with the cadmium yellow as well. Now I'm using the Faber-Castell Raw Umber pencil to add a bit more tone to the shadows that we can see under the eye. Now I'm tackling the really dark shadows we can see under the fringe and around the eye, and I'm using the dark flesh pencil for this. And now I've finished drawing in the darker shadows, I'm going to go back in with the cadmium orange and do another quick layer of the highlights to make sure they're really coming through and not getting lost in the layering process. And it's still looking darker to me than what we currently have, so I'm switching back to the burnt sienna pencil and adding another layer of colour using this. Now we're going to move on and tackle the top of his fringe, and this is quite a complicated area, so we're going to go quite gradually. Again, I'm starting off using the brown ochre, and I'm using this to try to sketch out those mid-tone orange areas and to also map out in my head which direction the fur is going in and where it keeps changing. So this part is going to be quite slow as the fur is going in all different directions. Now I've sketched out this small area, I'm going to make the highlights look really obvious to me using the cadmium yellow pencil. And you can see I'm just adding this mainly towards those little flicks of fur that you can see crossing over the rest of the fur. Now I'm using the cadmium orange to start capturing some of those really bright orange looking areas, and hopefully it's easier to do now that you've mapped it out using the brown ochre. And I'm continuing to build up this really nice orange colour across the fringe area. But you can see I'm making sure to keep clear of those yellow highlights that we drew in just before, and that as I'm building up colour around them, they're starting to stand out more and more. Now I'll add in some shadows using the burnt sienna, and doing this should make everything seem a bit more defined and make a bit more sense of the current mess that we've got. Now I'm going back in with the cadmium orange to build up those orange tones. And you can see I'm not doing it across the whole strand of fur. I'm actually focusing more on just building up at the base of the strand. You can see in the photograph that each strand or clump of fur starts off quite dark and brown, then moves into this nice orangey colour, and then at the very end of it it's quite white yellow looking. So I want to make sure I'm capturing that in the drawing as well. And now everything's looking a bit clearer to me. I'm using the dark flesh to really emphasize some of the shadows. And I can do this with confidence now because I can clearly see that I've got everything in the right place. Now we're moving on to drawing the right ear, and the technique for this is going to be very similar to how we drew in the left ear. I'm starting off with a brown ochre pencil, and I'm also doing a few soft lines towards the edge of the ear to make it look really nice and fluffy. Then I'm continuing to build a nice layer of this colour across the whole section. I'll also complete this last area of fringe in this section too. I'm using the cadmium orange to build up the orange colour now. And also the cadmium yellow to get those yellow highlights in. And using the burnt sienna pencil, I just want to add in some of these shadows too. And once I've mapped out the shadows using the burnt sienna, I'll go back in with the dark flesh and make some areas really dark. I'll blend out the burnt sienna shadow we've made here using the brown ochre pencil. And I'll add a cadmium yellow highlight to the tip of the ear here. And also the body area towards the right hand side looks really yellow, so I'm starting to colour that in using the cadmium yellow pencil. Now I've switched over to the cadmium orange pencil and I'll cover a very similar area to the yellow. I'm using the burnt sienna pencil now again to colour in these shadow areas that I can see and get that really nice reddy brown colour. Now we'll move on to draw in the rest of the body, and I'm sticking with using the burnt sienna pencil for this section, and I'm focusing on those areas of blue we've already outlined, and I'm extending those a little. And I'm being quite loose with my pencil movements as the fur here is quite loose and a bit chaotic. So you don't need to be too precious with where you're drawing at the moment. Instead, it's really good to focus on building up those darker layers here. Now I'm going to fill in the gaps with the brown ochre pencil, as these are the highlight areas. And I'm continuing to extend the section that we're working on. And you can see the left hand side of the body is really dark and under the shadow because of his head. But the right hand side gets a lot lighter, so I want to gradually make that happen using these colours. Now I'm using the cadmium orange to pick out a few nice orange highlights in the brown ochre areas we've just drawn. With the dark flesh pencil, I'm going over the darkest shadows that I can see. And if you've kept to using a light pencil layer, then the dark blue outline that we did earlier should show through. So it should be really easy to map out where these shadows are. I've switched back to the burnt sienna pencil to continue building up this redder colour. This is a lot more red toned than the dark flesh pencil. Now I've got the cadmium yellow pencil to add a little bit of yellow tone to this long section here. And once you've got a few pencil layers down, you can be quite loose when adding a bit of tone like this. So you can see with the yellow pencil, I am just covering the whole area, and only little parts of it will pick up a really yellow colour. And that's because we've already got layers of pencil down, so it won't go onto the paper evenly as if we were just colouring on a fresh sheet of paper. And now we're almost at the end of this step. We just need to finish off this lighter section of his body here. So again, I'm using the brown ochre pencil to sketch out a nice layer of pencil. As this is a lighter section, I'm using the brown ochre more as a shadow colour than a mid-tone colour. And at the edges, I'm making sure to use some nice wispy markings with the pencil to keep the cow looking really fluffy and soft. This top area of the body is looking quite yellow. I think it's reflecting the sunlight a little, so I'm using the cadmium yellow to sketch in a nice layer here. And I'll also use this colour to add a few highlights towards the bottom area. Now I'll use the burnt sienna to start adding the dark shadows across this area as well. And there are quite a few distinct lines that we can see in the photograph. So I'm being really careful and trying to map these out in the same place on my drawing. Now I'll start to build up the really nice orange colour, again using the cadmium orange pencil. And you can use this to slightly blend out the burnt sienna colour. You don't just have to stick to colouring in the highlights, they can overlap, and it makes a really nice blended effect if you do this. And I'm switching to the cadmium yellow pencil again, as I just want to make sure this yellow colour is really coming through. Now using the dark flesh pencil, I'm picking out the darkest shadows I can see in this section. And that is the final thing we need to do for this step. And even though this is the longest step of the whole tutorial and it's been about an hour and a half of drawing, you can hopefully see that it's made such a difference and that your Highland cow is really coming to life on the paper now. Steps 6, 7 and 8 are really just about fine-tuning what we've already got down, so I would say the hard part is done and we've almost finished a lovely drawing together. I'd love to see how your drawings are coming along, or if you need any additional help or guidance, please just pop me a message or leave a comment.